Torej, zelo sem vesel, da lahko tukaj pozdravim našega današnjega gosta, Johna Paula Newmana, ki je profesor na Irski nacionalni univerzi v Minutu in tukaj pri nas gostuje po zaslugi programa Erasmus, ki ga tako prijazno in benevolentno financira Evropska unija. John Paul Newman je, kot sem nedavno izvedel, oziroma pred dnevi izvedel, svojo zgodovinarsko kariero pravzaprav začel na nek način v Ljubljani, ko se je udeležil tečaja slovenskega jezika in tukaj zagledal neke vrste oglas Marka Cornwalla in vodilnih specialistov, ali pa lahko rečem vodilnega britanskega specialista za zgodovino habsburške monarhije, ki je iskal doktorskega študenta na temo, ki nekako sodi v zgodovino jugovzhodne Evrope oziroma habsburške monarhije. No, pod mentorstvom Marka Cornwalla je potem doktoriral na univerzi v Southamptonu in bil potem v letih 2008-2011 podoktorski raziskovalec na University College Dublin na Irskem, kjer je raziskoval v okviru ERC projekta, ki ga je takrat na tej univerzi vodil znani nemški zgodovinar Robert Gerwart. John Paul Newman raziskuje sodobno zgodovino Balkana in pa Srednje Evrope, pri čemer je njegov fokus na Jugoslaviji, nekdanji Jugoslaviji, Bulgariji, Makedoniji in pa na prostoru nekdanje Češko-Slovaške. Ukvarja se z veterani, s paravojaškim nasiljem in pa tudi z drugimi posledicami Prve svetovne vojne. Njegova monografija Jugoslavia in the Shadow of War, ki se ukvarja z vlogo veteranov v politiki prve jugoslovanske države, je išla leta 2015, v letu 2018 je bila ponatisnjena v paperbacku in v lanskem letu je tudi išla v srbskem prevodu v Beogradu. Poleg te knjige so uredil še nekaj zbornikov, v glavnem se ukvarjajo z vlogo veteranov v evropski politiki, se pravi v širšem kontekstu po Prvi svetovni vojni. To je zbornik The First World War and the Veterans Internationalism iz leta 2013, potem skupaj z Markom Cornwallom zbornik Sacrifice and Rebirth, The Legacy of the Great War in East Central Europe, se pravi zbornik, ki se ukvarja z dediščino Prve svetovne vojne v srednjem vzhodni Evropi in pa lani skupaj z Marijo Falino in Judy Devlin tu, in Judy Devlin tudi zbornik World War I in Central and Eastern Europe, Politics, Conflicts and Military Experience. Je pa tudi avtor poglavja, in s tem zaključujem, Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Europe 1917-1923 v Cambridge History of Communism, ki je išla leta 2017 in odtod tudi njegovo današnje predavanje. John Paul, now it's your turn.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, thank you very much, Rob, for, as far as I understood this, to be a very gracious and generous introduction today. I'm very grateful for that. So as Rob says, I've been in Ljubljana many times, and on this trip, I've been here about a week on this Erasmus teaching exchange, and in that week I didn't see everybody that I hoped that I would see, even though I saw a lot of people. I had an intention to do some work in Nuuk. I think I spent one day there, and so I'm realizing now that in future, when I come to Ljubljana, the first week should be simply set aside, meeting everyone, seeing the city once again, and then in the second and third week I should stay on and start my actual work. So a week is simply not enough time. Okay, so once again, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for coming today. Rock has invited me to revisit a topic, a project that I worked on some years ago, about the period immediately at the end of the First World War. And a few years ago, I've been invited by Stephen Smith and Sylvia Pons to write a short piece in the Cambridge History of Communism, dealing with the period immediately after the First World War, from 1917 to 1923, to think a little bit about the parameters of revolution, but also of counter-revolution. And as I started to work on this topic, and as I sort of started to write it, it's always the same. You have 8,000 words, and it's simply not enough space to do all of the things that you want to do. So I sort of submitted the first version of this article, which of course was far too long. Hoped they wouldn't notice. Indeed, they did notice. Told me to cut it back. And then, so I behaved like a good author, and they behaved like good, strict editors. So it's been a few years. The book has come out. It came out in 2017, of course, the centennial of the October Revolution, and I haven't really thought again about that. But in the interim, there have been some important publications and some important discussions about this topic. And I guess the most notable, the most widely known book is Robert Gebhardt's study called The Vanquish, How the War Failed to End, 1917 to 1923. And I'm pretty sure that Professor Gebhardt is coming later on to Ljubljana, so perhaps I can sort of, I won't steal his thunder. He'll have a chance to sort of make his own arguments. But I wrote this piece, and it occurred to me that the revolution was an interesting thing, but the counter-revolution, which I want to talk a little bit about today, was also a very interesting story, and one perhaps that we hadn't properly understood on its own terms. Frequently, we thought of the counter-revolution as simply a negation of the revolution itself, and we kind of thought, well, okay, this is simply a reaction against the big sort of changes that are happening in Europe from sort of from 1917 until the beginning, the early 1920s, and perhaps we weren't thinking about the people who were involved in the counter-revolution. We weren't thinking closely enough about their ideas, about what sort of animated them and what motivated them. So if I'm to return to this topic, as I will do today, I want to try to think about those positive aspects, those really existing aspects of the counter-revolution, try to understand it on its own terms, try to understand the things that it was, that constituted the counter-revolution, and try to do a little bit about that. So I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about where it came from, but I've also kind of used, in today's paper, I'm sort of using archetypal figures, individuals who were involved in these revolutionary moments from 1917 to 1923. And this was one of the things that I had wanted to do in the original article. I wanted to sort of illustrate what was happening by talking about the individuals, the men and the women who were kind of caught up in this story. And this is something very difficult to do in 8,000 words. It's something that's much easier to do in a longer book, in a longer monograph. But I didn't have the chance to do that in this short article, but maybe I will have the chance to do that in today's talk. So that's what I want to do. I'll talk a little bit about where it came from. I'll talk about my own ideas, and I'll try to talk about some of the key figures in this counter-revolutionary movement. Now, to begin, I'd like to set out some parameters. The conventional understanding, I think this is very important when we talk about the period 1917 until 1923. The conventional understanding until relatively recently of the war years has been very Western-centric. We thought about the First World War as something that begins in 1914 and ends in 1918. And that's that for a very long time when political historians and when military historians think about the conflict and think about the violence of the First World War. They have thought about this in this very kind of strictly demarcated timeline. But recently, over the past sort of 10 years, historians, many of them in Dublin, but not just there, have started to toy, have started to think again about this period of violence at the beginning of the 20th century. And there's been a sort of a discussion about how 1918, Armistice Day, November 1918, in many respects was not a meaningful end to violence. The war is not like a light switch. You can't simply turn off the violence and everything ends. And some of the work that I had been doing before I wrote this article was looking at the way the violence in much of Europe continued beyond 1918 and even into the early 20s, sort of 1922 to 1923. Now, at the other end of the timeline, the violence and the fighting does not, it even begins before 1914. And this is something that we had known. We, people who have been working on the Balkans, working on Serbia, working on Montenegro, working on these kinds of countries, we had known, of course, that 1914, at least in this region, was not the beginning of total war, was not the beginning of total conflict. In 1912, as many of you will know, the Balkan Alliance, Greece, Montenegro, Serbia, and Bulgaria launched a war against the Ottoman Empire, which in fact turned out to be a very successful conflict. This was in 1912. It was immediately followed in 1913 by a second Balkan War when Bulgaria turned on its former allies, and then its former allies turned back on Bulgaria with a vengeance. Now, the Serbian armies and the Montenegrin armies and the Bulgarian armies continued to be mobilized from 1912. They demobilized between the end of the Second Balkan War and the beginning of the First Balkan War. So the timeline, the chronology of fighting in the Balkans begins in 1912 and it kind of carries on. It doesn't even end in 1918, so I said it goes on to the early 20s. And when I was writing about the memory of the First World War in Serbia and in what had been Yugoslavia, this is something that is immediately striking and immediately obvious. Just like in my own country, Great Britain, every village, every town in Serbia was in some way marked by the war years, by the years, the two Balkan Wars, and even more violently the First World War. And the plaques and the monuments in Serbia will have the dates 1912 till 1918, just as the monuments and the plaques in Great Britain and France would have the years 1914 to 1918. So it's something that's very obvious, something that's very clear. Now, there is a monument just down the road, which I'm hazarding, because actually I don't know too much about this monument, but this is a monument to Slovene volunteers who elected to fight for the Entente powers. First of all, the Serbia and Montenegro in the First Balkan War, and then again in the First World War. And I don't know too much about this monument, other than that it was put up, I guess, after the Second World War and around about this time. Okay, so I won't go too far down this road to risk sort of embarrassing myself. But this is an example here in Slovenia of this alternate timeline. The marks, the dates on this monument begin in 1912 and end in 1918. So it's not so much a Great War that we're talking about. It's not 1914 until 1918. As a matter of fact, it's a greater war. It's almost a decade of conflict, a decade of violence that begins in 1912 and ends in sort of 1922 and 1923. Now, within that timeline, of course, there are very important turning points, very important junctures. And I think the two most important junctures, the two that I want to sort of talk about today, are the ones that take place in 1917 and 1918. The one initiated in Russia by Lenin and by the Bolsheviks, and then the second one, no less revolutionary, initiated by the American President Woodrow Wilson, really at the beginning of 1918. And I want to sort of put it to you today, I want to argue that these two men, their revolutionary ideas really constitute the sort of the primal scene, constitute the sort of, also the ideas of the counter-revolution, protesting and sort of, opposing the ideas of these two men really kind of creates the ideology, creates the program of the counter-revolution. So let me begin then with Lenin. This is a picture of Lenin arriving in 1917 at the Finland station in what was then called Petrograd, what is today, of course, Petersburg. Now, Lenin's return to, Lenin had been, of course, in exile outside of Russia. He had been sent back by the Germans into his home country of Russia. The hope of the Germans was that Lenin returning, this kind of left-wing revolutionary figure, would be able to kind of foment trouble, would be able to sort of cause revolution, would be able to cause kind of mischief back in Russia. This was, of course, a policy that Germany would be pursuing in various parts of Europe. They also, of course, sent submarines carrying Roger Casement back to Ireland in the hope to sort of undermine the British Empire. Now, Lenin, in fact, was much more successful, and of course, as we all know, Russia being sort of fatigued by war, coming at the end of this very long period of total conflict, was really sort of prone, was really sort of ripe for this radical revolution. And at the end of 1917, Lenin and his faction of the Russian Social Democratic Party, the Bolsheviks, were able to sort of they were able to succeed in capturing power in the imperial capital, Petrograd. Of course, this initiated a new conflict, a civil war, which ultimately the Bolsheviks were able to win. So this period of Russian history is also, of course, a period of conflict which doesn't end until the early 1920s. Now, ultimately, it was Lenin's hope and the hope of the Bolsheviks, and indeed a necessity of the Bolsheviks, that what they had achieved in Russia, this revolution, would spread very quickly to the rest of the world. This was the theory of permanent revolution elaborated by people like Lev Trotsky. And this was terribly necessary, of course, for the Russians, for the Bolsheviks. They knew that they felt at the time that their revolution would not survive if they could not sort of, if it did not spark in other places like Germany and Central Europe. And then they believed that what they had done, what they had achieved in Petrograd would be the first act of a global revolutionary drama that we can kind of, unfold across the entire world. Now, it didn't work out like that in practice, as we all know. And ultimately, by the time we get into the sort of late 20s, the early 30s, the notion of world revolution has been essentially put on hold. And particularly as Stalin becomes the sort of prominence of power within what is now the Soviet Union, the notion of a global revolution begins to sort of be sidelined by the Bolsheviks. But nevertheless, in the early stages, in the period that I'm interested in, 1917 until 1923, the prospect of a global revolution, the prospect of a much larger conflagration, was one that was felt to be very sort of real, was one that was really considered to be a possible outcome. Now, later on, the commentator would call this period from 1917 to 1923 the Red Wave. And indeed, in these early days, there were some quite daunting and quite impressive, albeit short-lived, reflections and ramifications of the Bolshevik War. There were uprisings inspired by the Bolsheviks in places like Munich, Berlin, in Budapest, which I'll talk about momentarily, for a very brief period of about 3 weeks. There was also one in, there was a Soviet Republic in Slovakia. Initially at least, what had happened, what Lenin had achieved with this revolution in Russia did seem to be occurring also in the, it did seem that there was a possibility, that there was a hope, or indeed a fear, that the Bolshevik Revolution could indeed be repeated throughout Central Europe and throughout other parts of Europe. So along with these uprisings, there was also many people, many soldiers, many of the Austro-Hungarian army had been serving in Russia, and they had been captured in Russia. And of course, when the Bolsheviks came to power, these men were sort of released from captivity and told that they could, if they wished, they could go home. And many of them did gradually start flocking towards the beginning of 1918. And many of these former POWs did begin to start flocking back home towards their homes in Central Europe and in East Central Europe. And they did kind of have this inspiration. They did have these revolutionary slogans on their lips. They did believe that what had happened in Russia might also happen back in their own country. So from 1917 to 1923, although it didn't occur in sort of reality, although the Bolshevik Revolution was not repeated, at least not successfully repeated, anywhere else in the world. There was a genuine sort of moment from 1917 till 1923, what the Communist International would later call the Red Wave, where it did seem that a kind of global revolution might be possible, that something like this might happen. There are two men who were sort of caught up in this, who would be the first sort of examples, the archetypes that I wanted to mention, and these are two people who will be known to many people, I think, in this audience. One was Josip Broz, of course, the man who would go on to become the communist president, the communist dictator of Yugoslavia. Josip Broz was a Habsburg subject, of course. He came from the small village of Kumrovac, which is on the Slovene-Croatian border, as many of you will know. Josip Broz was enlisted into the Habsburg army at the beginning of the First World War. He served very briefly on the Balkan front in Serbia, something which his subsequent biographers kind of kept quiet, because when he became the president of Yugoslavia, it was perhaps not very diplomatic to sort of acknowledge that he had been part of this conflict against the Serbs. But he also went, of course, out to the east. He was captured, and he witnessed the Bolshevik Revolution firsthand. Now, it's not clear that this was the moment that Tito turned to communism. I think this happened a little bit later in the 1920s, when he was sort of part of the trades union movement. But nevertheless, Tito was one example of somebody, and there were many more like him. Bela Kun, a Hungarian communist leader, about whom I'll speak momentarily, who witnessed the Bolshevik Revolution, who saw what had happened, and who started to travel back to their own countries, talking in very simplified terms about what they had witnessed, about what they had seen, and about the possibility of a Bolshevik-style revolution taking place in their own country. Now, there's somebody else who many of you may know, the great Croat author Miroslav Krleža. Krleža was also a Habsburg subject. He was from just outside of Zagreb. And as a young sort of man, Krleža had been part of one of these Habsburg academies. He had served in the Ludoviceum. He had sort of been enrolled there in one of these kind of elite Habsburg schools. And Krleža was in fact expelled from this school, I think in 1913, after he tried to enlist, he tried to volunteer for the Serbian army. They turned him down, but when his teachers at the Habsburg military academy found out that he was trying to volunteer for Serbia, they were not best pleased, and they expelled him, of course, from the academy. Now, in 1914, Krleža rejoined. He was enlisted. In fact, into the same regiment, the 25th regiment based in Zagreb, the same regiment as Tito. They did not meet until a little bit later on, and of course Krleža and Tito became very good friends, but they'd had at least a similar war. You know, they'd gone through the same regiment during the First World War. Now, Krleža was back in the conflict during the First World War, but he was now in a very different position. When he had been at the academy, the Ludoviceum, he had been part of the officer elite. He'd been at a very high, prestigious level of Habsburg society. Now, in 1914, when he was remobilized, he was surrounded by the sort of the peasant soldiers, the enlisted soldiers. And he never fired a shot in anger. He was sort of pulled out of the war, I think, and he was in Galicia for a while. And then I think in 1916 he came back to Zagreb, and he spent the rest of the war working in one of these hospitals, one of these kind of charitable movement, charitable groups. And he wrote some very good fiction, some very good stories about his time in the First World War, which were published in the early 20s under the title Hrvatski Bog Mars, the Croatian god Mars. Krleža had indeed become a communist during the First World War, and he was savagely critical of what had happened during the First World War, complaining about how the peasants simply didn't ask questions about what they were doing. He complained bitterly about the sort of the Habsburg officer corps, how they were sort of traitors to their nation. Many of them, of course, were South Slavs, and many of them had sort of come out of these milieux. There's a short story. One of the short stories in the Croatian god Mars is a story about two peasant soldiers trying to understand what is happening in Russia, and they're sort of talking about, who is Lenin, what is this, what are these revolutionary slogans, what is happening out there. And Filozofska makes it very clear by putting words into the mouths of these characters that their understanding of the Russian Revolution is very unsophisticated. They haven't read Marx, they haven't read Engels, they don't really know who Trotsky is, they don't know who Zinoviev exactly is, but nevertheless, kind of the simple slogans of the Bolsheviks, freedom, bread, and no end, an end to the war. These things were very potent and were very sort of, these things made a big impact on simple soldiers. So there's on the one hand, there's this kind of uprisings at the end of the First World War. The Spartacus uprising in Berlin, the Commune in Munich, the uprising in Budapest. But on the other hand, there is this much more simple story of soldiers who have served in the war, who have seen what's happened in Russia, and who are coming home with these kind of revolutionary slogans on their lips, believing that the meaning of what has happened, it means that they will not have to fight any longer, that this is the end of the war. So the Bolshevik Revolution, although it never sort of settles in Central and Eastern Europe at this time, it becomes a very important talisman. It becomes, there's a great sort of hope, but also a great fear that something like this could be repeated, something like this could be duplicated elsewhere. Now, of course, for the counter-revolution, for the anti-communists, the notion, the fear that what Lenin has done, what the Russians, what the Bolsheviks have done in Russia, becomes one of the great mobilizing factors. And a lot of the violence of the counter-revolution, in places like Germany, in places later on, like Soviet Hungary, comes from this great sort of fear, this great panic, if you like, that what has happened in Russia will kind of remain and will kind of return, will come to Central and Eastern Europe. So these uprisings in places like Berlin and Munich, this kind of revolutionary fervor, men coming home and talking about Bolshevism, talking about how what has happened in Russia could happen also in Munich or Berlin or Budapest, becomes one of the key sort of mobilizing factors for many people who were involved in the counter-revolution from sort of 1917 until 1923. Now, as this picture shows, it very quickly becomes entangled and entwined with sort of traditional anti-Semitism. There was a notion that the leaders of the Bolshevik movement, even not Lenin himself, that people like Trotsky, they are Jewish, that somehow this is some kind of Judeo-Bolshevik plot, that the Jews are sort of creating some kind of mischief, that this is a Jewish conspiracy hatched in Russia, and will now come back to Central and Eastern Europe. Now, recently, there's a very good book that's been published by an American historian called Paul Newman. He's written a book called The Specter, Haunting Europe. And in this book, he talks about this myth of Judaism and Bolshevism, Judeo-Bolshevism becoming sort of entangled. But it is nevertheless something which never leaves, I think, as Paul kind of explains in his book, the notion that the Bolshevik Revolution is a Jewish conspiracy, and is something that's been hatched by the Russian Jews. It's something that really kind of is born, if you like, in the counter-revolution, but it remains a very potent image and a very powerful image throughout the sort of the 1920s and 1930s. So anti-Semitism and anti-Bolshevism, at a very early stage, become very quickly entangled, very quickly constituting self-sustaining parts of the counter-revolution. Now, the second person, of course, is Woodrow Wilson, and his ideas are no less revolutionary, I would argue, than Lenin's and than the Bolsheviks. But of course, Woodrow Wilson is coming at these ideas from a very different perspective. Woodrow Wilson, of course, is the American president, and he's quite an unusual figure in the context of American presidents. He's an intellectual, which is a bit of maybe an unkind thing to say, given the present example of the office holder, but the less said about that, I think, the better. Woodrow Wilson, I think, was a professor at Columbia University, had a PhD, as far as I know, the only American president to have held such a high degree. And he was also, of course, the first American president who took a state visit, took a foreign visit whilst in office, and it was precisely at the end of the First World War, the sort of come to Paris and to play, at least initially, a very important role in deciding what the map of Europe would look like at the end of the First World War. Now, Woodrow Wilson, his ideas, as I say, were no less, I think, revolutionary than those of Lenin, and they were no less sort of powerful in motivating people from across the continent, across the world. So as many people sort of thought that in Lenin and the Bolshevik Revolution, here was a chance to end the war, here was a chance to sort of stop fighting. Many people also looked upon Woodrow Wilson, perhaps not fully understanding his ideas either, but also thinking that here was a way to sort of end this conflict. Here was a notion of sort of universal justice. Here was a notion of sort of not having to fight for foreign armies, not having to fight for empires, not having to fight against one's own interest. Now, the phrase ex occidenta lux, I found in a book by a Croatian journalist who had also served in the First World War, a man called Josip Horvat. And in this book, Horvat is sort of saying, well, look, we mustn't underestimate, the sort of electrifying effect that Woodrow Wilson had on many of us who were fighting in the First World War. His ideas, even if we didn't understand what self-determination exactly meant, his rhetoric, his symbol, his notion of kind of coming over to Europe and saying that the old ways would be ended. This was a very potent kind of image for many people. Now, indeed, he did inspire people from across the continent and really from very far-flung lengths. People like Eamon de Valera, who I think wanted to or did go to America to petition the American president. Eamon de Valera was the leader of the national movement in Ireland. So I live and I work in Ireland, and recently there's been a very good documentary called The Irish Revolution, published by broadcast by the national broadcaster in Ireland, which has really sort of reclaimed. For a very long time we didn't know much about these internationalist dimensions of the Irish Revolution. But for Eamon de Valera, Woodrow Wilson, his notions of self-determination, these were sort of great moments, great ideologies of hope, sort of a great belief that this was one way out of this conundrum. At the other end, you have someone like Ho Chi Minh, who arrived at the Paris Peace Conferences in 1919, hoping that in Southeast Asia, he could present the credentials of a country which he would call Vietnam, and that this country would also become would gain its independence, and would sort of, the principles of Wilsonian self-determination would also be respected across the sort of, the global South and the colonies of France and of Great Britain. Now, of course, ultimately, Wilson's universal ideas were not as universal as he had initially claimed. Some people would get self-determination, and other people would not get self-determination. And Ho Chi Minh was one of the people who left the conferences very disappointed. He had not, his aspirations for Vietnamese nationhood had not been fulfilled. They had been ignored. And of course, we all know the subsequent story. Ho Chi Minh turned his back on this kind of liberal internationalism, turned his back on Wilsonian self-determination, and will re-emerge in the period of decolonization after the Second World War as a trenchant enemy of the West and as a die-hard sort of communist. And so he ultimately, having been abandoned by Woodrow Wilson, he sort of decided to go in a very different way. So this again was an electrifying moment, just like Lenin's revolution. What Wilson was proposing was a moment which really sort of opened up the hopes and opened up the aspirations for many people. And De Valera and Ho Chi Minh were just two examples. Now this is in front of the train station, the main train station, the central train station in Prague, a monument to Woodrow Wilson. The central train station in Prague is currently called Hlavní nádraží. But in the interwar period, when Czechoslovakia first gained its independence, this station had been called Wilson Station. It had been named in honor of the American president. It's not unusual in Central and Eastern Europe, in the so-called successor states of Austria-Hungary, in places like Poland, in places like Yugoslavia, the Kingdom of Serbia, Slovenians, that is, in places like Czechoslovakia, to have monuments, to have streets, to have central squares named after Wilson. Now, of course, after the Second World War, Wilson was no longer particularly favoured by the socialist governments and by the socialist leaders. So after the Second World War, what had been Wilson Station in Prague went back to being the main station, the central station. But then there is nevertheless, once again, a monument to Wilson. There was a plaque to Wilson, and there is this kind of residual sense that Wilson was a great man and was a great figure, was a great champion of the small peoples of Central and Eastern Europe. Now, I don't know about Ljubljana, maybe one of you would know better than me, but I do know that in Zagreb, in the interwar period, what is now Roosevelt Square, I think, was what had been called Wilson Square in the 1920s and the 1930s. Of course, it had changed at the end of the Second World War, when Tito and when the communists came into power. So Wilson was a great figure of hope for many people, and he became a great hero for many people, and for many peoples who had, what they felt to be their national aspirations realized in the peace treaties at the end of the First World War. But one of the great problems with Wilson, and I think one of the other great sort of mobilizing factors of the counter-revolution was. Okay, we're back in order. One of the great mobilizing factors of the counter-revolution was that Wilson's ideas were not applicable, were not able to be applied universally. That notwithstanding the notion that national self-determination was something that all peoples were entitled to, that all peoples should get, there were many people who did not, who were not, given the right to national self-determination, who did not get these aspirations. So there were many people, many countries, many states, many peoples throughout Europe at the end of the First World War who felt extremely bitter and extremely resentful that what they felt to be their aspirations, their national aspirations, had been denied and had been ignored, had been forgotten, had been declined. Now, Ho Chi Minh is a very extreme example, but there are of course many more people like that in the Middle East. King Faisal, for example, also petitioned of what would become Saudi Arabia, also petitioned the Paris Peace Conferences, hoping for sort of national independence. He didn't get it. The states of the Middle East were sort of subordinated into this system of Franco-British mandates, and these were also very, very many disappointments. Now, of course, in Central and Eastern Europe, there are many peoples also. That it was impossible to draw borders over the former empires, over the former places like Austria-Hungary. It was impossible to sort of apply Wilson's principles of national self-determination universally. So there were many people who sort of went home empty-handed, and this also created a moment of great bitterness and great resentment. There were many people who sort of looked at the Paris Peace Conferences, looked at the Wilsonian settlement, and felt themselves to be the sort of the losers, the people who had sort of lost out because of this settlement. Now there's a huge literature on precisely this feeling of bitterness caused at the end of the Second World War. Those people who felt that they had lost the war, those people who felt that their rights to self-determination were ignored, were trampled upon in the peace conferences at the end of the First World War. People have talked a lot about how this sense of bitterness, this sense of despair, this sense of defeat was really a very powerful and very potent force mobilizing people into action at the end of the First World War. Now, there are two very good books. One which I've mentioned already, Robert Gerhardt's book, The Vanquished, in which he writes about how a lot of the violence of the counter-revolution, a lot of the trouble, a lot of the conflict that arrives after the First World War, from sort of 1917 until 1923, is caused precisely by this kind of feeling of bitterness, this feeling of defeat. The shock of defeat, the trauma of defeat, in places like Hungary, in places like Bulgaria, in places, of course, like Germany and Austria and Hungary, sort of supercharges, recharges many people to go once again into battle, to sort of fight on. So for Gerhardt, the sense of defeat, this sense of being denied national self-determination, the sense of losing the war is one of the kind of the main factors, one of the main motivating forces for the counter-revolution from 1917, 1918 onwards until sort of 1923. Now, there's also a book by a German journalist, a man called Wolfgang Schiffelbusch, who has also written, his book is a series of case studies in which he talks about the trauma and the shock of losing a war and how this kind of manifests itself in various countries and various states. His examples, I think, are the American South, which of course is a very important topic and a very sort of relevant topic at the moment. He talks about France after the defeat of 1870, 1871 in the Franco-Prussian War, and he talks about Germany after the First World War from 1918 onwards. And Schiffelbusch also sort of talks about how a state that suffers a defeat sort of seeks for regenerative projects, seeks to sort of try to regain its dignity, to try to sort of get back onto its feet. And this is also a very powerful sort of political force which shapes the way states move in the future. Now, the most famous example of this, of course, of the counter-revolution, if you like, coming out of the defeat, is Germany itself. Germany is the defeated state par excellence at the end of the First World War. And this notion of defeat, this notion of resentment, this notion of bitterness is really captured, of course, by Adolf Hitler. He seems to be the person, by the end of the 1920s, the beginning of the 1930s, who most successfully articulates this kind of sense of humiliation caused by the defeat, caused by the shock of loss at the end of the First World War. Hitler, having been a soldier himself during the First World War, having worked very hard to sort of create this sort of false myth about his own war record, is somebody who very successfully sort of channels these feelings of despair, tells the German people, look, we were defeated in 1918, but we can restore our dignity through these kind of revisionist politics, through these radical far-right programs. So Germany is this kind of, this sort of sense of the counter-revolution coming out of the sense of disappointment and a sense of defeat in 1918, 1919. Hitler is probably the best known example, and Germany is the best known example of this kind of shock of defeat and this kind of shock of trauma. But there are many others. Another example, of course, would be Hungary. Hungary had been part of Austria-Hungary during the First World War, and the Paris Peace Treaties of 1918, 1919 really stripped the Hungarians of many of what they considered to be their sort of, their national territories, their historic territories. So in the case of Hungary, decision after decision at the Paris Peace Conferences is going against the Hungarians. They lose territory to Romania, they lose territory to the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes, they lose territory to Slovakia, to Czechoslovakia, they lose territory to Romania, Transylvania, a very important sort of historic territory of Romania. So the sense of bitterness, the sense that the Wilsonian principles are kind of hypocritical, that they're not being applied evenly in a balanced way, that they're not being applied to their own state. It's something that's felt very keenly in Hungary. Now, Hungarian history from sort of 1918 to 1920 is a very turbulent period. It's a period where the political pendulum is swinging backwards and forwards, and there's a huge amount of turmoil. There's a huge amount of sort of conflict and political transformation. The initial sort of leader of post-war Hungary, a man named Mihály Károlyi, attempts to sort of bring the country to terms with the Paris Peace Treaties. Tries to accept these losses. Tries to restore a kind of liberal political culture to the country, but ultimately, his regime, his sort of government, is overthrown by this far left Bolshevik movement led by the Hungarian communist leader Béla Kun. And Béla Kun sort of is seeming to promise, he comes into power, he's somebody who is inspired by the Bolsheviks, inspired by what's happening in revolutionary Russia. And when Bela Kun takes power in Hungary, he seems to be sort of saying, you know, we don't have to accept what is happening to us. You know, we can seek a radical alternative. You know, we can look to the ideas of Lenin, we can look to the ideas that are coming out of Russia, and we can maybe sort of change our fortunes. We don't have to sort of align ourselves to the Wilsonian peace. We don't have to align ourselves to these bitter humiliations. We don't have to sort of go along with the flow. You know, we can fight back, we can step back against this. Now, Bela Kun's Hungarian communist experiment is very short-lived. You know, it only lasts about 100 days, and it's very quickly overthrown by a subsequent counter-revolution, anti-communist. You know, the kind of people, the kind of movement that I was speaking about earlier in this talk, the kind of people who are petrified by Bolshevism, petrified by what is happening in Russia. You know, they look at Bela Kun, a Hungarian Jewish leader, and they think all of our worst fears are kind of being realized by this sort of, you know, this experiment in communism. You know, everything, all of the chaos, all of the killing, all of the disasters that seem to be unfolding in revolutionary Russia will now come to sort of Central Europe, and they'll now come to our own country. So Bela Kun's experiment doesn't last very long. The counter-revolution, very quickly, you know, the right wing, the white terror, the white revolution very quickly mobilizes its own forces and is successful in sort of pushing away Bela Kun and is successful in sort of moving him to one side. And the great figure of the Hungarian counter-revolution is, of course, Miklos Horthy. And there's a very famous image of Horthy arriving after Bela Kun's Hungarian Soviet has been overthrown, you know, legendarily arriving in Budapest on a white horse and claiming that he would now punish sinful Budapest for supporting Bela Kun, for supporting the communists, for sort of going along with this experiment. Now, in Hungary, the counter-revolution is an extremely violent process. Once Bela Kun has been, you know, he deserts the country. I think he ends up briefly in Germany, but ultimately, of course, in the Soviet Union. But for those who remain, Miklos Horthy's forces, the white forces, the counter-revolutionary forces, enact a terrible vengeance upon all of those people, you know, who are deemed to have supported Bela Kun and to have supported the communist revolution during 1920. Now, Bela Kun himself had carried out violence against many people, but the violence that came against him, the violence that came after him, really kind of eclipsed, you know, the white terror that followed the red terror really eclipsed all of the things that had come before it. And it's really here that we start to see, you know, this conflation between Bolshevism, between Judaism, you know, this sort of entangling of these two properties. You know, the symbol, you know, for Horthy's forces, for the men who sort of overthrew the Red Revolution, the Communist Revolution in Hungary. You know, there was a great sense that you know, the people who've been responsible for this were sort of, you know, Hungarian Jews, people like Bela Kun. You know, there was a great sort of anti-Semitic tone to a lot of the violence that came in Hungary from sort of 1920 onwards. Now that I think is quite typical of the counter-revolution, and it's one of the things that I tried to argue in the article that I'd written for this book on for this Cambridge history of communism. It's very typical that the counter-revolution eclipses, in terms of sort of violence, in terms of its sort of ferocity, it almost always eclipses, you know, the sort of threat that has come before it. You know, either because it exaggerates the notion of the amount of support for communism, the amount of sort of left-wing revolution that there is in the country, or because it simply is much more successful at mobilizing violence, it's better armed, it has a greater capacity for violence. I think that there's something very similar happening in Italy at the end of the First World War. Of course, there is a communist movement. There is a revolution in, you know, the red years of 1919 and 1920. But when Mussolini's fascists come into power, when they organise their own sort of violence, they are tending to sort of exaggerate and sort of amplify the amount of threat that they're this I think is very typical of the counter-revolution. In its zeal, in its ideology, it tends to sort of eclipse the sort of violence, the initial violence that is faced. Now, closer to home, there are also elements of a kind of counter-revolution, an anti-Wilsonian revolution taking place very near here. These are two people who many of you will no doubt know, whose names you will know: Ante Pavelić and Gustav Perečec. Pavelić and Perečec. Pavelić had been a lawyer during the First World War, a Croatian lawyer. He had not served in the First World War. He was sort of doing his legal training, so he was not sort of, he got an exemption from fighting in the First World War. But nevertheless, at the end of the First World War, he was somebody who had hoped that the rights of national self-determination for the Croats would be honoured and would be sort of realised by Woodrow Wilson. And for men like Pavelić, they were a fringe, they were a minority within the Croatian national movement. But nevertheless, the creation of the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes, the creation of the South Slav state, was felt by them to be a great denial of their sort of legitimate aspirations for national self-determination. So in the 1920s, Pavelić remained bitterly opposed to the Belgrade regime, bitterly opposed to Yugoslavia. At the end of the 1920s, when the Yugoslav king Alexander Karađorđević announces his royal dictatorship in January 1929, Pavelić and his close associate Perečec, who had been an officer in the Austro-Hungarian army, go into exile and start to mobilize a violent kind of a violent sort of response, a violent challenge to Yugoslavia. Now, what I think is quite interesting about Pavelić and about the movement that of course would become Ustaša, is that in its initial phases, when Pavelić articulates his demands, when he complains about the position of Croats within Yugoslavia, he does so in strictly Wilsonian terms. He writes petitions to Geneva, to the League of Nations, and he says, look, what we're asking for is nothing more than what's being given to other nations within Europe. We're not looking for a radical upheaval. We're not looking to sort of change politics in any kind of radical way. We simply want the rights of self-determination for the Croats to be honoured, in our own backyard, in our own country. Now, as the 30s go on, Pavelić comes under the influence, comes under the wing of Italian fascism. His movement mutates into something much more radical, much more right-wing. But initially, at least, Pavelić is part of this kind of counter-revolution, which is kind of opposing what has happened in Yugoslavia, and just simply asking, in very straightforward terms, for the rights of national self-determination to be granted also to the Croats. Now, my last example, this will have to be my last example because I think I'm running out of time. I am running out of time. Is the country of Bulgaria. So Bulgaria is also a country whose timeline resembles this sort of timeline of the Greater War, which I've mentioned at the beginning of the lecture. The Bulgarian state goes to war in 1912 in the First Balkan War. It fights and it loses the Second Balkan War, and then of course it remobilizes during the First World War to try to regain the territories, places like Macedonia, places like Thrace, which it had lost mainly to the Serbians in the Second Balkan War. So Bulgaria is kind of like a defeated state par excellence, even more maybe than Germany. It's defeated in 1913 in the Second Balkan War, but it's then again defeated catastrophically in 1918. And there are very large territories, places like what is today Macedonia, which are sort of coveted by the Bulgarian state, which are desired by the Bulgarian state, but which of course it doesn't get. Now the trajectory of counter-revolution is no less violent and no less dramatic in Bulgaria than it had been in Hungary. Just like in Hungary, initially the post-war leader of Bulgaria was the peasant leader, a man called Alexander Stambolijski. And Stamboliski had hoped, Stamboliski had been imprisoned by the Bulgarian royal regime during the First World War. He had been an anti-war voice. But at the end of the First World War, he was released from prison, and he was seen as somebody who could come to power and perhaps reconcile this new Bulgarian state to the Wilsonian order as it was emerging in the post-war period. And Stamboliski was not part of this kind of nationalist crowd. He did not have connections with the Macedonians. He was not somebody who was clamoring for these territories which Bulgaria had lost to be returned to the Bulgarian state. So he was somebody, not a revisionist, somebody who was willing to accept the defeat, somebody who was willing to accept the terms as they were dictated to the Bulgarians. Of course, the losers were not entitled to sort of join, not entitled to attend the peace conferences. Stamboliski was somebody who hoped that Bulgaria could be reconciled to this sort of post-war order. Now, Stamboliski, just like Karoli and just like Bela Kun, did not last very long in power in Bulgaria. It was not just that he was sort of not willing to chase after these unredeemed territories, but also the nature of Stamboliski's rule was sort of very alienating and very kind of problematic for many people who lived in Bulgaria. He had his own kind of paramilitary organization, the so-called Orange Guards. He attempted to sort of push through a series of sort of policies which, in the midst of this sort of chaos at the end of the First World War, were very difficult to realize, were very difficult to sort of set up. So very quickly, Stamboliski lost ground, and he kind of started to lose control of this country. But he was particularly despised by this man, amongst many, a man called Todor Alexandrov, who was the leader of a very powerful Macedonian paramilitary organization, the Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization. In English, for the sake of brevity, we call it IMRO. And Stamboliski was despised by IMRO and was despised by Todor Alexandrov precisely because of this reconciliatory position, this reconciliatory stance he was taking towards Wilson, towards the peace conferences, towards the territorial losses that Bulgaria was facing at the end of the First World War. Todor Alexandrov had also been under arms throughout the period of the Greater War. He had served as a guerrilla soldier even before the First Balkan War began. When the First Balkan War began in 1912, he served as an auxiliary of the Bulgarian army. During the First World War, when Bulgaria temporarily defeated and occupied Serbia, he was one of the most important commanders of this kind of counterinsurgency operation of this Bulgarian occupation regime within Serbia. And at the end of the First World War, when the peace treaties were signed, and when the Bulgarian army was defeated, he and his soldiers kind of refused to accept what had happened. They continued under arms, and they continued to sort of wage war way into the sort of the mid-1920s. And for Alexandrov, his counter-revolution was first and foremost a matter of kind of territorial. It was first and foremost a matter of territory. He was sort of mobilized by these territorial losses that the Bulgarian state had faced from sort of 1918 onwards. He refused to accept the loss of Macedonia. He refused to become reconciled to this, and he was staunchly opposed and staunchly supporting any kind of action, any kind of sort of military action that could reverse these losses. Now, from 1920 until 1921, the IMRO, the Internal Macedonian Revolutionary, led by Todor Alexandrov, was essentially able to operate in a patch of territory which sort of straddled the Yugoslav state and the Bulgarian state, and really became like a state in its own right. It was called the Petric District. Stamboliski was not able to sort of infiltrate these areas. The Yugoslav government, the Belgrade government, the army was also having great difficulty infiltrating these areas. And IMRO and Todor Alexandrov sort of ruled this place like a mini-state. They kind of collected taxes. They recruited men into their guerrilla forces, into their cheta, into their units, and for a very long period of time, this spoke to the kind of the power and the strength of Imro. Now, ultimately, there was a coup against Stamboliski. He had alienated very powerful groups in the Bulgarian army, various sort of officers' leagues, various kind of groups who were sort of who were opposed to what Stamboliski had done. And then in 1920 there was this coup against Stamboliski. Now we see here the kind of the symbolic punitive violence, if you like, of the counter-revolution, and it comes back to this point that I was making earlier, that the counter-revolution is much better at mobilizing violence, is much more effective, and is much more ferocious when it needs to be done. Stamboliski was very famous. Stamboliski was at his estate when the coup took place, and he was captured by soldiers of Todorov's units. And it is said, no one really knows exactly what had happened or what happened to Stamboliski, but it is said that Todor Alexandros and Alexandros men subjected Stamboliski to a very brutal, protracted sort of torture, goading him, mocking him. Recently, Stamboliski had signed a treaty with Yugoslavia saying that they would not pursue these territories in Macedonia, that they would sort of leave them to the Yugoslav state. Todor Alexandros men very, very famously is said to have cut off the hand that signed this kind of offensive peace treaty. And it is also said that they beheaded Stamboliski, sent his head in a biscuit tin to Sofia as kind of a warning for anybody who would sort of stand up against the Macedonians, stand up against the counter-revolution. So, a sense of what happened in Bulgaria is very similar to what happened, if you like, in Germany, but also what happened in Hungary. You have this kind of asymmetry of violence. You have a revolutionary movement. You have a kind of defeat. You have resentment against the Wilsonian order. But the counter-revolution tends to sort of, really amplify all of the troubles and all of the violence that has gone on before. The ferocity of Todor Alexandros' violence, the ferocity of the sort of, the white terror in places like Hungary tends to sort of outmatch, tends to outlast the initial kind of spontaneous revolutionary problems in these countries. The counter-revolution seems to be much better at mobilizing, much better at articulating, much better at performing violence. Now, so I should come back now and try to answer this question in the last kind of 2 or 3 minutes about what exactly is the counter-revolution. Well, I guess I don't really have an answer to this, despite the fact that I've been speaking now for 1 hour. There's not really, I still sort of think that there's not really a clear sort of articulation in this program. Part of the problem is that there's no common term, there's no kind of 21 conditions of membership. There's no Marx and Engels of the counter-revolution. So, whereas if we want to talk about the revolutionary movement, it's very, we have a corpus of texts. We have a sort of defined program. It's very clear, in a sense, what we're dealing with. We can understand it in its own terms. The counter-revolution is a little bit like fascism in this respect. It doesn't have a corpus of its own documents. It tends to define itself through negations. It's much more about action, it's much more about performance, it's much more about enacting violence than it is kind of sitting around and discussing its political program, discussing its political goals. The one thing I would say, it's something that I did try to say also in this article, and this will be my last point now, that there does seem to be, that this sort of, the success that the counter-revolution has in amplifying and exaggerating the sort of the threat of revolution, the threat of red terror, the threat of Bolshevism, does seem to be something that also kind of the liberal order takes on board. It seems to me that if push comes to shove, if a conservative government in a country like Italy or Germany or Hungary is faced with the prospect of a communist revolution, it will tend to turn towards the right-wing forces, you know, the counter-revolutionary forces, people like Milošević, people like Todor Alexandrov, people, if you like Benito Mussolini or Adolf Hitler. It seems to me that this sort of, you know, the liberal centre, if you like, seems in a sense to be sort of also feared by this kind of specter of revolution. You know, this notion of this large kind of global Jewish conspiracy, which is, you know, going to consume the country at any point. And this, beyond the period of sort of red wave, beyond the period of the early 1920s, really becomes a very fatal problem, I think, for many governments and many states in the 1920s and the 1930s. Time and time again, they kind of believe this exaggerated threat of communist revolution, and then they kind of tone down, they sort of underestimate the potential dangers and the potential hazards of siding with somebody like Adolf Hitler, of siding with somebody like Benito Mussolini. And so I guess that might be one of the most sort of long-lasting impacts, one of the most long-lasting effects of the counter-revolution, way after the Red Wave, way after the Bolsheviks have essentially abandoned the notion of creating a global revolution. You know, the counter-revolution is still very successful in kind of articulating this fear of revolution, articulating this kind of ongoing threat of you know, imminent communist revolution. Okay, I guess then I'll end there. Thank you.
Časa za diskusijo je zdaj torej še nekaj, bom rekel, več kot dovolj, tako da prosim vprašanja, prosim seveda, da kratka in konkretna. Če se damo v angleščini, sicer pa se bo John Paul potrudil razumeti slovensko vprašanje, ali pa jih bom jaz prevedel.
Your concept of the greater war, and I agree with you that many European or world events are measured by the Western side, by means of the Western side, and I have to, when I was looking at some, let's say, economical files of the firms, the fabrics, and checking their balance sheets, I also noticed that a huge change developed already in the 1912. Yeah. So I think that I just wanted to add to your concept that this discrepancy, the lower production is visible also in economical fields, and that in some ways supports your thesis more. But I would like to know, why did you choose the end of this greater war? What was the reason you chose 1923? I also think that I mean, you have to take into account these regional differences, because in some places violence and counter-revolutions or revolutions were periodicized in a different way.
Okay, thank you very much for those questions. I should say first of all that it's actually my term, the Greater War. It's really coming from this book series at Oxford University Press, edited by Robert Gebhardt, and I think he's the person who actually came up with this. Ultimately, came up with this concept. When I joined the project about 10 years ago, we were looking at the end of the war. But as a Balkanist coming in, you know, quite early on, I was able to say, well, look, you know, it's not just that it goes on after 1918, but it also continues. You know, it starts earlier. It starts, you know, there's decade of violence. There's a decade of conflict, which could be said to have begun in 1912. So that's I think that's how we start to think about this in much larger terms. The regional differences are very interesting. I mean, it is quite strange actually that if you take a country like Great Britain, it's not intuitive really that we would think of that conflict ending in 1918, because in fact it doesn't. There's violence continuing in Ireland with the Irish War of Independence and the Civil War. So British forces and British auxiliaries and the British Army and the British state, it's not that their war ends in 1918 either. It really does continue into the early 1920s. So it's quite strange then that nevertheless the sort of the defining parameters of this conflict remain sort of 1914 to 1918. Now, having said that, within this decade, there are, of course, pivotal moments, and those pivotal moments very often depend upon, as you say, regional variations. And so, in today's talk, in today's discussion, I kind of pointed out the Russian Revolution and the sort of the Wilsonian settlements of 1917, 1918, and of course also arguably 1919. And I think those are key pivotal moments throughout Europe, throughout the world. I mean, they affect people like De Valera. They affect people like Ho Chi Minh. And so those are really central kind of pivotal points which are important and relevant and significant for pretty much everywhere. But then again, other than that, along this timeline, of course, different points have different importance for different states. I mean, in the Balkans, of course, the key turning points, the key moments would be, they really be sort of the First Balkan War. For Bulgaria, it's the Second Balkan War, 1913. That's really their first kind of, their first national trauma, their national crisis. In a country like Ireland, of course, it's 1916. It's the failed Republican Revolution, which only seems to have failed in the short term, but actually in the longer term proves to sort of ignite what becomes a successful war of national liberation. And then if we take a country like Poland, I didn't speak about it, of course, but 1920, 1921, the signing of the Treaty of Riga. That's a very important moment, not just for Poland, it kind of creates the state, it wards off this kind of threat of Soviet invasion, but it's also, I think, a very important point, throughout Europe. Sort of the end of the Polish-Soviet War, the signing of the Treaty of Riga is really the sort of, it kind of demarcates those two worlds that I spoke about today. The Wilsonian world, the world of national self-determination, in the West, Poland and westwards, and then the sort of the Bolshevik world, the world of Lenin, the world of the Soviet Revolution. So there are, there's a period of conflict which is embroiling more or less all of Europe, if not all of the world, from sort of 1912 until sort of somewhere in the early 1920s. But within this decade of conflict, there's very important regional variations, regional differences, and those regional differences are sort of depending on where you are and which country you're in. I mean, in a country like Montenegro, I mean, the conflict doesn't really end until sort of 1925, 1926. Those forces that had been opposed to the unification with Serbia and therefore with Yugoslavia, they continue fighting. Albeit in a sporadic form, right up until sort of the mid-1920s. So the timeline is also here not hard and fast, and it can alter quite dramatically depending on which perspective, which viewpoint regionally you're taking.
What about 23?
It seems to me that that's kind of maybe I'm being a bit kind of Comintern here, because that's their first period. They had these different sort of periods, didn't they? The first period is 1917 to 1923. Then there's the second period, Then there's the famous third period of class against class, which is of course how they failed to sort of deal with Adolf Hitler. So maybe I'm just sort of, thinking in terms of, sort of communist internationalism and saying, well, here, there's the Comintern talked about this period from 1917 to 1923. That's where they feel their red wave subsided. So maybe we sort of take it in on their own terms. It's also the timeline that Steve Smith gave me when he commissioned me to write this piece back sort of 5 or 6 years ago. So it's kind of what was given to me to work with. But in fact, it's open for debate, isn't it? We could talk about whether this is really the ending point.
Thank you.
But in the context of the Great War, it is the year when Turkish were independence, and so
yeah, that's right.
It makes sense.
Yeah. That's also the end of outright to large-scale fighting as well.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It was very interesting, and I have a lot of questions. I'm limiting myself to a couple of them. First, I was wondering if it might be useful to think in terms of revolutions and counter-revolutions, not just in a sense in a nominalistic way, but because if you start from Lenin, you seem to suggest that the revolution is the Bolshevik revolution. And for instance, in the former Russian Empire, you have a real competition between different revolutionary projects. I think that's the socialist revolutionary project. And on the other hand, the Italian fascism, in a sense, claimed to be a revolution. So it is something in between the logic of revolution and that of counter-revolution. So that's one question. The other one is a smaller one. It concerns, did you find any clue or track of anti-Americanism in the counter-revolutionary propaganda? Because you talk a lot about the relationship between these movements and the Wilsonian idea of a new order. I was wondering if they, alongside anti-Bolshevism, you can find also anti-Americanism in there.
That's a very good question, actually. So first of all, on the notion of revolution, I agree, of course. Again, maybe it comes back to Ushka's point about perspective and about where you are, and what's happening in your own backyard. That will alter what you think of the great revolutionary moments. Of course, in Ireland, it would be 1916. To a certain extent, I think also in Central Asia, where in 1916 you had those anti-conscription riots, and there was mass killing and mass pogroms there. That would be a sort of a moment of revolutionary turn. I think in terms of sort of European, in terms of global transformative moments, I would still sort of argue that those are the two most important figures and the two most important turning points. This kind of Leninist Bolshevik revolution in 1917, and then this Wilsonian moment in 1918. In practical terms, it's the Wilsonian settlement which shapes not just Europe, but of course also the Middle East. It's defined in those terms. So in terms of practical, real politics, Wilsonian, is arguably that's a concrete sort of series of national revolutions which are sort of solidified with these borders. In terms of Lenin, as I argued at the beginning, in the early part of this lecture, ultimately that's not successful outside of what would become the Soviet Union. But nevertheless, there are brief abortive successes in places like Hungary and Berlin and Slovakia and these sorts of things. The sort of the fear, what Paul Newman has called the specter of Bolshevism looms very large. You can see that in Freikorps memoirs, and it's sort of in the way Adolf Hitler talks about this period in Mein Kampf. The specter of Bolshevism, the specter, it's the anti-Semitic trope of the Judeo-Bolshevik threat. Seems to be something which is very quickly gains currency throughout the continent, throughout the world. In terms of anti-Americanism, I never found it actually, which is not to say that I don't think it exists. but I'm sure it's out there, and perhaps it does take very similar a similar form to the kind of anti-Semitic ideas. It might be something to do with Rothschild and these other kind of American banking conspiracies. There are articulations of positive. It's not really positive about America itself. It's much more based around the sort of figure of Wilson and the idealized notion. All of the things that we sort of have in our mind when we think of Wilson: idealistic, untainted, a figure who Josip Horvath, the crowd author that I mentioned, calls him Fortinbras. It's the figure at the end of Hamlet who comes in and cleans everything up after all the other characters have kind of killed one another. So they kind of focus around, they kind of solidify around Wilson himself. But having said that, there would be knowledge of America, as we know from emigration, as we know from reading people like Tarazada. There are many people from Central and Eastern Europe, from Italy indeed, who migrated to America at before the First World War, and there were quite a few of them who sort of volunteered to fight. Slovenes coming back from America to fight for the Entente. So there would be a knowledge of America, in a sense, a kind of mirror of this sort of, these kind of returnees, these men that I spoke about, who would, people like Tito, who had served in Russia, who were coming back to their own homes, their own hearths, and they were bringing with them, these incredible stories about nomads and people riding yaks and this great sort of Orientalist colour. There was no doubt also Occidentalist colour, of people sort of coming back from America and talking about, the great sort of Fordist, cities, Detroit and this sort of thing, and the great factories. I'm sure it's out there. I've never sort of thought about it systematically. I've never found sort of systematic evidence of that. But surely surely notions pro and anti-Americanism would be there. Not sure if there's potent as sort of anti-Bolshevism and anti-Russianism, but they're surely around. I mean, I'm rambling a little bit now, but the other thing you have to understand is that if you take someone like Pavlovich or Todor Alexandrov, although they're mobilized against the post-war order and they want to get Croatia out of Yugoslavia, or they want to get Macedonia into Bulgaria, at least in the initial phases, they're not anti-Wilson, they're actually pro-Wilson. If you look through those files, those petitions in places like Geneva, they're not ridiculing, they're not rubbishing Wilson himself, they're supporting him actually. They're speaking to Wilson, they're speaking to the peace conferences, they're speaking to the League of Nations in Wilsonian terms. I mean, Pavlovich's early petitions, that they have nothing to do with fascism, they have nothing to do with the far right. They're all about, Wilson is great, Wilsonian self-determination is great, it's just that we're not getting our fair share. The same could be said for the Bohemian Germans, until it becomes, of course, fascisized by Heinlein and by Hitler. In the case of the Ustasha, which you would know much better than me, of course, Marco, by sort of Benito Mussolini and by these things. So it kind of, that strand of the counter-revolution is initially yes, Wilson, but just with different borders, please, and then it becomes something much more radical, much more sort of challenging to the liberal order, if you like.
Mogoče eno res kratko vprašanje, short answer.
Okay, I can try.
We can just have time for one more. Če mi daš kakšno vprašanje?
Thank you very much for the lecture. I'll maybe start off by picking up where you left with the petitions. So a couple of your examples practically started with a non-violent way of conflict.
contributed to these open letters to various governments and groups we dislike and we feel are taking countries like Hungary and America in the wrong direction. You do wonder, don't you, when you sort of, when you co-sign a letter to the Guardian newspaper or the New York Times or something, whether that's really going to make a difference to sort of Viktor Orban or to Alexander Vucic or to something like this. So sometimes these are just sort of gestures, like at least you're doing something. Having said that, this period, if we stick to this period of 1917 to 1923, it is a period of great uncertainty. It's not at all clear. As it is, when we look at it in 2019, or even if you're looking at it in sort of 1945 or 46, it is clear that those settlements are not shifting in a dramatic or radical way. But in 1918, 1919, 1920, 1921, it's not at all clear what's going to emerge, actually. Could be that the Bolshevik Revolution spreads its wings way over to Germany. It could be that the Wilsonian order is upset and something else emerges in its place. So it's not at all settled. There's a lot of dust in the air. There's a lot of violence. As I've said in this lecture, and as other people like Gerhard have written, the conflict is still ongoing in many places. You have somebody like Todor Alexandrov who, say this country is in Yugoslavia, but the reality says that these territories are owned and occupied by the Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization. They're the real law on the ground. So from that worm's eye view, at that period, nothing is settled, nothing seems to be settled, and the notion of petitioning Wilson really could be, it really does seem like this could make a difference. And there were a lot of those experts. There were people like, Hugh Seaton Watson, to a certain extent, the great sort of state formers, people like Masaryk and Benesch. All they were doing is petitioning, the great powers. They were making their case at Geneva. They were explaining why those German-populated territories in Western Bohemia, so-called Sudetenlands, needed to be part of Czechoslovakia and shouldn't become part of an Austria or a German state. So it's a period of sort of speaking to people like Lloyd George, speaking to people like Clemenceau, speaking to people like Wilson, who after all, they're not experts, they don't know. I mean, Lloyd George really didn't know anything, did he, about these territories. He was quite ignorant, actually. He didn't know who the Slovenes were, or because he hated the Poles. But I mean, it was not clear at all. These were people who did not have huge amounts of, they didn't have PhDs in Central European history or ethnography. So their ears could be twisted, if you like. They could be persuaded. And so for someone like Alexandrov, for someone like Stepan Radic, for somebody like Ante Pavlich later on, probably they did think there was a chance that, if they wrote a convincing case, if they brought that to the great powers, things could change. And they did, didn't they? I mean, look what happened 20 years later in Munich. For various reasons, Neville Chamberlain was willing to open up the settlement once again and to offer some sort of corrections. He was willing to acknowledge, what he believed was a sort of a border rectification that needed to be made.
We need to wrap this up.
I see that, yeah.
So, če so še kakšno vprašanje, morda še v neformalnem delu, sicer pa moramo počasi končati, ker bojo predavalnico potrebovali drugi. Še enkrat vsem hvala, ker ste prišli. Thank you for this wonderful lecture, and I hope to see you again in Ljubljana.
Oh, yes.